Thank you so much can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. I want to start with just a few bio questions. Tell us about where you're from and where you grew up.
So I grew up, and I'm going to just maybe turn a little bit. I kind of feel like my back is to this part of the audience, so I'm going to slide back there so it seems a little more open overall. But I'm a native Midwesterner, so grew up in Illinois, kind of about half in Illinois, northern Illinois, and half in southern Wisconsin. And so, and I don't know, is
that me?
No, that's him.
That's me. Can you
lower your
You bet. Let's just see what we can do to get this to work. And it'll probably just clip onto the front. Let's just see how this... Is that better?
Yeah.
No. As long as I don't move, it'll be perfect, right? Yeah. But hopefully we'll find a means. Here, we got... let me just come down a little bit further here. Or I could actually just hold it if that...
Can
or is it
at your radio? I think it's the radio.
It's the radio? You bet. And or maybe we could put that, just on the table. Will that work? All right, let's see how that goes. Now we'll try clipping back on here, and see how we can do.
All right, take two.
Yeah, I think that sounds better here. Yeah.
You were talking about growing up in the Midwest.
Exactly.
So, do you remember, was there a moment when you knew, I want to be a doctor, and this is the work I want to do? Do you have a poignant moment like that, or is it kind of something you grew into?
I would say it's a little bit of each, and I think I would just even kind of paraphrase that or go back just a little bit before touching on that. I talked about growing up in the Midwest, and one of the questions that I get asked many times in venues like this is, well, the people presume that I must have been, the son of a group of ambassadors who spoke 6 languages and had traveled all over the world, and the truth of the matter was, I'm not sure either of my parents had ever been outside of the United States more than, kind of in military service, speaking for my father. But, I'd never been outside of the U.S. at all prior to, and I should say, again, a trip over to the border into Canada, but, hadn't really traveled more globally, if I can use that term, until I was in medical school. So I kind of grew up what might be termed a sheltered Midwestern existence, where you thought that going to Ohio was a big adventure, and so there's not necessarily a predilection, I guess I would say, or a need for people who are involved in global health to have this extensive exposure for people in the room who may not have done much traveling and wondering, is that a prerequisite? And the answer is not necessarily. Talking about medicine, again, well, here's where I am not afraid to get into the full disclosure mode. So when I was about the age of, people, here in the audience, I think it was our junior year of high school, they did a survey that you basically filled out this, and it wasn't online in those days, but a paper sort of choice selection. What would you rather do? Which of these sounds more appealing to you? And then from that, they would construct what would be your ideal profession. And, I went into the meeting with the guidance counselor, as they were called at our school, that kind of helped with your future career planning with this, hopes that it was going to be something very dramatic and exciting. And again, vividly remember the individual saying, well, John, we've processed your data, and it looks like you're going to be best suited to be a librarian. And again, there's probably a librarian in the room here right now, so I don't mean to this. In fact, I have my youngest daughter is right now working on getting a master's in library science combined with an MFA. So maybe there was some genetic translation of that, but I think it speaks to, one shouldn't be feeling too pigeonholed by, where you may be. But I really didn't have any medical influences in my family. Neither of my parents had medical professions, and I went to college college thinking that I wanted to be a math professor, which again, I don't want to say that's maybe one step up in nerdiness from being a librarian, but again, here's somebody who thinks that being a nerd is totally okay.
You're amongst friends here.
Yeah, there we go. I've lived it. I think I was an officer in our school chess club and a whole variety of other things that might put me in that category. But I, really had not had any exposure or thought that I wanted to do anything in medicine. And then after my first year of college, I was involved in an organization that was part of Dartmouth called the Tucker Foundation, which was really sort of a service-oriented organization. And so I was placed on working in a Job Corps center that was for Native Americans. And this was out in western Montana. And as part of that experience, I had a chance to, I was teaching GED classes, so kind of a high school equivalency classes for people who may not know what that is. And so we did that 4 days a week. And then for 1 day a week, the roles were sort of reversed, and I was the student. And we went out on these various work projects, and we're doing things like driving trucks and operating heavy equipment and forestry. And so I was the one who was then more in the pupil role, and the people who are my students the other days of the week were the ones who were instructing me. So it was a great experience to kind of have that counterpoint, and as we were talking about earlier, getting into or beyond your comfort zone in terms of what is doing in terms of activities. But during that time, I was very impressed by the number of individuals who were telling stories about that were in this project, that were telling stories about in their backgrounds how there had been insufficient access to medical care and various adverse events that had arisen from that.
On the reservation.
Yes, from they were from the Native Americans were really from all over the U.S. And Alaska as well, and so it got me to thinking, well, maybe, being a math professor isn't exactly what I wanted to do. Yeah. And so that started to steer me, I guess, towards medicine as a
What year in
career.
College was that?
So this was between my freshman and sophomore years. So I hadn't really been pre-med, and what I did was manage to get those classes accomplished, but sort of never was really fully integrated into the pre-med aspect of it. I continued with the math major, and so followed through with that.
How did you decide on the type of medicine you wanted to practice?
And the answer there is, I guess I would say it has sort of a two-part saga. And so,
tell them about the medicine you practice.
So so my current practice is in pediatric surgery, and so that is general surgery for infants and children, but putting the historical timeline in the proper order. When I started medical school, my goal actually was I wanted to do family practice, and I wanted to actually work with Native American populations. That was kind of the orientation, very much tied into this experience that I'd had as an undergraduate. And so I was fortunate to receive a scholarship from the federal government that then covered all of my tuition, and the mandate was that I practice some sort of primary care, which included either family practice, general pediatrics, or general internal medicine, were really the main options at that point. So the obligation was I would pay back this scholarship period with work in one of those disciplines. So to some degree, it sort of channeled me into thinking that that's the direction I wanted to head. And then I got into my surgical rotation and realized, this is, I'm really kind of enjoying this to a degree that I shouldn't.
And during medical school, you rotate through different disciplines.
Exactly, yes, precisely. So we'd have 8 to 12 week blocks through the various specialties. And so I did the surgical block and really liked it, but I also in the back of my mind said, but I have kind of signed on. I have this obligation to be fulfilling this scholarship and doing primary care. I'm going to just set that aside, and I can always revisit that. So I did then a year of internship, or the first year out of medical school, in family practice, and realized I didn't want to fully finish. It's a 3-year residency or period of training that takes, but realized that probably wasn't the direction that I wanted to go. And so after that first year, then went and fulfilled this obligation, worked out on the Navajo Reservation out in Arizona, and after those 4 years, then went kind of had the opportunity to think more about all of the career direction that I wanted to take, and decided that I wanted to go into surgery. So then had to kind of go back to step one again in the whole training process and be an intern for the second time, which is, trying to draw an analogy here, it's probably like being a freshman twice. Basically, you'd say that's an experience I didn't feel like I needed to replicate, but there we go. Yeah. But anyway, wound up then having to go back and sort of retrain at that point and in surgery. So, and that's what I've been doing then for the last 20 plus years is been in the pediatric surgery realm of medical practice.
Wow. Can you share what your role currently is with, and let me clarify this, Doctors Without Borders is referred to by its French name, right? French?
Mm-hmm.
Right? We got this right? MSF, and that stands for?
Médecins Sans Frontières, right?
So as we talk Doctors Without Borders, we're just going to say MSF, and that's kind of the inside lingo, I guess.
Yeah.
That's how right. So can you share what your role is with MSF and how long has your history been with them so far? Two-part, because I got lots of two-part questions.
Okay.
And then what inspired you to join MSF? So share a little bit of your role and then share how you decided to get involved.
Okay. So maybe I'll answer the first part of that first, because I think in some way it's maybe more interesting as far as that goes. But so I alluded to the fact that I really had not had any sort of exposure to international travel or being overseas at all, growing up, and then even through college. And so after my first year of medical school, I had sort of said to myself, this is a chance to travel and do something different and see something different. And so, as I was telling this story, I realized that it's hard to even relate, because this predates this thing called the internet, where you really couldn't just get online and say, I wonder where I want to go work. This involved writing these things called letters that were basically mailed. And so I used a thing called a book, and I, again, don't mean to be too facetious, but just listed a variety of medical schools overseas in English-speaking countries, because I didn't really have fluency in any other language. And so picked schools in India, Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and just mailed off a letter that said, dear sir or madam, I'm interested in potentially working with you in a nutrition project is what I was, wanting to do. And then, just kind of waited for a response. And it took about 2 months, but finally heard back from a medical school in South Africa. So this was in 1977, dating myself and the process. And so I went, to South Africa, and subsequently actually went back in my last year of medical school for about 6 months to work there. And it was in so many ways the kind of the best educational experience that I had overall. It was a very bedside-oriented teaching, but there was a lot of formality to it, but I benefited tremendously, I guess I would say, in terms of the exposure and the experience that I had and the opportunity to really be doing hands-on things, but also realized that project or that period of time was very much about me kind of taking and not really doing much giving. So I didn't have a skill set or a set of qualifications that really benefited the individuals who I was acquiring this experience or knowledge from. And so I decided at that point that I very much wanted to pay this back to some degree, would be the best way I could give it and or phrase it. And so that that experience motivated me to say, at some point in my life, I want to be able to repay in kind the benefits that I've accrued from this experience. And so that very much got me then interested in the idea of global health. And then it was, how do I fit that into a career? So I had heard about MSF, and again, I couldn't tell you when, but probably read about it in the New York Times in the mid-'70s or late '70s, and had been very impressed with their work. But career-wise, then it was, how do I fit that into what for me was then a career in academic medicine, as well as having a family and all the various other kind of obligations that come with being an adult, where life stops being so much fun. But no, again, it's not all bad. Trust me. So MSF is pretty stringent about the time frame that they want you to work in the field. So when you go with them, as surgeons, we're lucky actually because it's a fairly short interval, 4 to 6 weeks, most of the times that we spend in the field. But for and for other physicians or nurses or other practitioners, it can be more like 6 months and a year that they mandate. But for me, it was then trying to find how can I get a period of time like that, which I couldn't initially do, and so I just did a variety of shorter 1 or 2 week projects that, and again, went to a whole variety of very interesting places, and some of those experiences were very rewarding, and others were the week or two that I was gone. It felt like most of that time I was just kind of getting acquainted with the circumstances of the spot that I was supposed to work in, or vice versa, people wanting to get familiar with me. Yeah. And anyway, then it finally took me, about, whatever, it was only 10 years ago that I first then went out into the field with MSF. And to make that happen, I had to really sort of prioritize that career-wise, which for me meant changing jobs and actually getting written into my contract that would allow me to spend 1 or 2 months per year working with MSF. So by that point, it had become.
Was that received well when you had that conversation? Is the medical industry at large supportive of I guess, what did I read? 4,500 doctors in the United States that were deployed this year. I think that's the number I got. Could be wrong. But.
Well, so for MSF, it's about 400 practitioners a year that MSF that come from the U.S. to work in our projects. But to answer the question, I would say it really wasn't very well received at the time that I was trying to make it happen. And increasingly the landscape within healthcare overall, I think, is more and more receptive and welcoming to global health overall. But I think the balance or the challenge to try to get activities in that regard set up kind of come down to what I might call the economics of healthcare, which is that increasingly it's it has aspects that are very much a business, and it's we hate to use words like profit or bottom line, but healthcare has that element, so that an individual who is spending 6 weeks overseas and isn't contributing anything to this enterprise, if I can use that term, was had this tendency to be frowned upon, to be honest with you. And so it's as I say, getting better and better, I think, progressively. But 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it was a very non-traditional request.
It's kind of a good segue into my next question. In terms of what has been the hardest thing about your job with MSF? What are the greatest challenges for you? And you kind of already, I think, talked a little bit about that. But and then what aspects of MSF are you most proud of? In terms of your personal work and whether it's in the field or on the board or any aspect of it that you feel really you go, this has been worthwhile. It's been worth the 10 years. Put into it.
So let me go back and answer part one a little bit. What do I do here right now? Because I kind of skipped over that. That's okay. This is what happens when you answer the second question first. Or it can be a good technique. I don't want to tell you anything about the first part of the question, so I'll just skip over that and hope everybody forgets. At any rate, so what I do currently is as the president of the board is really kind of an amalgam of different duties. So boards in general have I think the term that could best be used is fiduciary responsibility, meaning that you're looking out for the well-being of the entity that you're serving on the board of. And so that entails things that I might call as mundane as budgetary things, so making sure that that's all done appropriately, auditing that's done to make sure that your work is indeed sort of fiscally transparent and responsible. But then it also gets into programmatic development or areas of interest or focus that we may think is worthwhile. It's engaging. The MSF is sort of a unique thing, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, Kevin and I. But so our board members are all what are called association members, and so those are people who've actually worked out in field projects, and many times for charitable groups, board members means they're large donors, to be honest with you. So the people that have been very loyal financially to the given charitable group or organization, and so MSF is quite different. The entry to allow you to be on the board means you have to have spent time working in the field, and really, with I guess I would say with almost no exceptions, that actually means a fair amount of time that you would have devoted to
really
working in the field.
The work is.
Yeah. So, but what other things do I do in the course of my day? This is an example of speaking to various groups to talk about what it is. And when I say various groups, it's many times or almost always students that are, and this can be at your age, it can be college or university students, medical students, or trainees in medicine, so people in residencies. And speaking at conferences, similarly, talking about what we do. Fundraising and going to donors to talk about what it is that the activities that we undertake are all also part of it. And then what I would say is kind of the best part of the job, still in many regards, is I still get a chance to work in the field. Yeah. So I had mentioned again just a little bit earlier in speaking with Kevin that I had just gotten back from Liberia. So I was in Monrovia from January 4th until February 10th, and so working in a surgical project there. But that's another part of our activities, or the activities that are not required but permissible in this role, with the value being in terms of sort of having a hands-on familiarity with what our projects are like. So now getting back into the question, I've again managed to skip over one here, but
the hardest part of your job, and then the part you're most proud of. As a doctor. Yeah, so I think the hardest part of the job probably is coming to grips with the fact that there is so much need that exists for what an organization like ours could do, and there's no possible way that we can accomplish that single-handedly, which could also be a means to segue into talking about it's important that our organization and others work collaboratively in what we're doing. Then if you want to talk about the other aspect of what's the biggest reward or the greatest reward in what we do, I think I would probably answer that in two different means. And so the first would be, hopefully this doesn't sound like it coming off in a pessimistic tone, but I think there's so many things in the world right now that seem like they are negative events or developments, and I think it's easy, and whether we want to say that's the media, that's our own personal perspectives, or whatever slant we want to make as sort of responsible for that sentiment. But one of the greatest aspects of being in this position is that you get to see and work with a group of people that are exceptionally positive and see a lot of very good things that are happening or possible. And so I would throw out words like hope and potential. Even when you're in some of the most challenged environments you can imagine, you see that humanity is, I think, by nature, trends towards wanting to be positive and optimistic and forward thinking. And so to kind of counter the narrative, I guess I would say, that I think is all too prevalent, that the sky is falling. I don't know if Chicken Little is an analogy that people are familiar with, but But anyway, this feeling like all is woe is us, and that things are only going to be worse and worse from where they were previously, I think is something that working with MSF you really do get to see a very secondary or another way of viewing. And then tying into that, the opportunity, or to have the chance, and whether it's at a bigger programmatic standpoint, but very much in sort of individual patient counters, and even talking about as of 2 weeks ago, family members, of how appreciative they are of the services and the care that we provide for their children, being the area that I work in particular. It's tremendously rewarding to be able to be in that circumstance, or have the privilege to be put in that circumstance, as our donors do for those of us who work in the field. Yeah. So, I want to go to our first video clip, because we kind of started talking about the work a little bit.
Okay.
And in this video clip, we're gonna look at the construction of them building a field hospital. So Richard, can you move the lights and play that?
Oftentimes in an emergency situation, we need to have a hospital operational very quickly. We'll start with tents or with inflatable hospitals. This way, in a matter of a couple of days, we can have something operational in order to provide services. We very quickly want to transition from the temporary tent-based hospital into something that's more permanent. The first thing we have to do is to identify the location that we'll be building the hospital. We want to put the hospital in a location so that it's easy for people to access. Most of the refugees will be coming by foot or they'll be carried by stretcher. And so for this reason, we often try to put it as close to the population as possible. It's quite difficult to identify a site because typically refugee camps, they're put on the land that no one wants. It's oftentimes floodplains or it's sites that just don't have a good topography, then on places where there were former minefields given for refugee camps. Water for the hospital is very important. It's not just for drinking water, it's also to guarantee the hygiene within the hospital. We talk to the local community, we see what their opinions are, what their knowledge is of the region. We look for places where there's dried up riverbeds, and in those types of locations we can drill underneath the riverbed to find water. And then if we really can't find water anywhere, we start to use different creative methods. One method that we tried in South Sudan is we used the metal sticks method, where you take two bent metal rods in your hands and you walk very slowly over an area where you hope to find water, and then if water is under the ground, the sticks move and they cross over each other. Actually in Maban in South Sudan, we used this method and we were able to find water under the ground in a very dry region. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough water for the hospital, but it was enough water to have drinking water for the patients. Many of the places that we work have very intense wet seasons and very intense dry seasons. We want to get as much work as we can done during the dry season because once the rains come, the roads are washed out. Another issue is how to bring materials into the site. The places where we're working, there's not large markets available where we can access materials locally. So we have to bring in everything from outside. When we're bringing items across far distances, we also have to plan for backup supply chains. Oftentimes the roads that we're bringing materials on could be closed. We could be bringing materials across borders and borders could become closed. So for this reason, we always have to think of multiple ways to bring in different materials. Then we also need to identify the types of teams, the types of skills we can find. In some places we can find very good masons so we can get good concrete, and then we'll do cement construction. Other places we can identify only good carpenters, so we do wood construction. We really have to adapt our construction methods to what the local community is used to building. So when we're building our construction team, we want to bring in people from all different parts of the community. The reason we try to build diverse teams is because we want everyone to benefit from our services. By having a large diverse team, more people are aware of what we're doing there, and we're making the community a part of the building of the hospital that is there to service them.
I saw that and I was so impressed with humanity's ability to be able to erect something like that and to put it together. And what does a day in the life in that environment look like?
Well, and I think, maybe taking a step back just to, speak a little bit about that, one of the things I think that this video highlights very nicely is, even though our organization is a, humanitarian medical organization, it's only about half of the people that are working with us who are actually healthcare providers. So it just speaks to the importance of people of a variety of different skill sets or roles overall. And so, logistics people getting, equipment and supplies in. Right. If you're working off of a generator for power, making sure that that generator has fuel and is running properly. All those things are vitally important. And so the ability to kind of make a hospital appear, this video makes it look pretty easy, and it's yeah. I mean,
it does make it look easy, but
yeah.
What's the time frame from that, from beginning to operation?
Yeah, and again, it depends on the urgency of the situation. Clearly, when I was working in Haiti after the earthquake was probably the best example, where they just had a tent hospital that appeared literally over a matter of a day or two, the supplies were a little more challenging to get in just because there was only the one airport in Port-au-Prince that everybody had to be funneling through. But it really can be done quite rapidly, and it's one of the things that I think MSF does particularly well, because the history of going back now 45 years of sort of replicating, how you do that. Maybe not so much the actual construction of the hospital, but the staffing or the supply of the materials that you need to get projects going is something that's all kind of pre-programmed and sits in warehouses, sometimes closer to the field. The main global center is in Bordeaux, France, but there's packages that are like a cholera treatment program.
Waiting to be deployed.
Exactly. You can just go to a shelf. It's I don't know. I've not ever worked in a Walmart, but it's probably similar, where you have, here's what you need to get a kitchen session or a section opened up in a store, but it's all just very prescribed, and so this boxes of materials will go out, and it's not picking something out of a cabinet here and over here, and we might need one of these. That all goes very, very smoothly. The other thing, just to kind of bring up about this, the video, again, depending on the circumstance, and I think one of the ones that kind of comes to mind right now is with the Rohingya crisis. That's the population that's gone from Myanmar into Bangladesh, and a population of 500,000, 600,000 people that have needed to be accommodated in a whole variety of means, but including their health care. Well, there you need to create a facility to be working in. So a hospital, several hospitals and clinics have been constructed there in Bangladesh to accommodate the services that we're providing. But probably, as often, we will work inside an existing hospital that may be in the region where we're responding. And so that means that the facility may already be built, but it just needs to be supplied, or it may be, and again, talking about the part of that I know best, that the operating room may not have all the equipment and supplies that it needs, so that needs to be retrofitted and maybe the new lights put in, whatever it may be. But all of that is a very integral part of getting the project set up. And just to kind of follow on that thought very briefly, then when the time comes that the crisis has been deemed to have been adequately met, what's been put into that hospital then persists and stays there. And so it does have that advantage, as well as if you're integrating into something that's already an existing part of the local health scene, or what the Ministry of Health.
Lights back out.
Helping
exactly build up the infrastructure of that facility.
Exactly. So there's advantages, not that kind of putting a hospital up and then disassembling it doesn't potentially happen sometimes, but I think it's really more advantageous when you can find an existing structure, and sometimes the building may not be a hospital, but at least be able to move into something that you can then have as a lasting element of the project, having been there.
I have so many questions, but I want back to the day in the life.
Yes.
And part of that, can you include the actual surgical theater that you were in, and what is it like in terms of, is it similar to, being, are you able to replicate the surgical theater here and over and abroad? And what are the differences between the two? Yeah,
so I think the answer would probably be to say in large measure, yes. What's missing is the degree of sophistication is maybe the way that I would phrase it, or things being optimal. And so this is never being afraid to cast aspersions at myself or our profession, but surgeons by nature in the medical profession are known as being kind of high maintenance. They're the difficult, egotistical individuals, and of course,
surgical techs.
So, and that I dare say that reputation is pretty well deserved, I think, in some circles. But so what you don't have is a choice of 40 different sutures. There's 10 that they're going to say these are the ones that will work in any project, and the operating room light may not be as good as you're used to doing, but it works. So there are I think I would say compensations that you make, and I think the biggest ones kind of come in the realm of what might be the real high-level technology. And so, being more explicit, an X-ray machine in the operating room would be the norm for any of the kinds of activities that we're doing, whereas that's not something that you have access to, just as an example. But basic safety and monitoring equipment is something that would be replicated anywhere that we are. What else is different? Whether it's flies or mosquitoes find their way into the operating room in the U.S., that would probably lead to the whole hospital being closed, if that were to happen. But it's just some of the proximity to, you just don't have as many sets of doors, the barriers to the outside world. But in many ways, it functions, very similarly, I think is what I would say. Yeah.
And through the course of your day, depending on, I imagine, the mission, but how many surgeries are you doing, and what are the hours that you guys are keeping over this time period, and how are you guys taking care of yourselves emotionally during this period?
Yeah. So in terms of the length of the days and what you're able to accomplish, and I commonly bring this fact up, and people are somewhat surprised to hear it, but the most efficient operating rooms I've ever worked in are with MSF. And so I've had days where, and again, what defines an operation can be a fairly simple or straightforward cleaning of a wound, or what we call debridement, getting rid of tissue that isn't healthy in a given patient. But there have been times I've done 20 or 25 patients in a day where they may have the opportunity to have two different operating rooms kind of set up. And so you as the surgeon finish a case, you write a little note and kind of get the orders set for them, and then the patient's ready in the next operating room to go back and forth. And so the kind of the work ethic in many of these projects is exemplary. And again, talk about things that are kind of give you a feel good about what you're doing. And a lot of this is just motivated by the need that exists, in the facilities, and the people working there realizing if you don't push and kind of keep going, that there's no kind of days for catching up. You're just going to fall behind, and you're going to have patients' needs that aren't met. So this level of efficiency is something I think that is, as I say, surprising and gratifying. The duration. We try to not, overwork individuals, but it often means kind of having a person who's working during the day. So they may come in at 7 in the morning and work through till 5 p.m. And then because of security concerns on the ground, where teams aren't moving after sunsets, then you'll have another team that comes in at night and then stays in the hospital compound overnight. And then, the next morning you kind of have this sort of changeover where the new team, the day team, comes in, the night team then goes and sleeps and rests. In some of our smaller projects, and kind of similar to this experience I just finished in Liberia, I was the only surgeon there. So I basically, from when I started until I left, I was on call all the time. And there it was a more secure environment, and we could travel after sunset back and forth from where we were living to where the hospital was. But again, the days were not uncommonly 11 or 12 hours, and I would say probably at least half the days I didn't even take a break for lunch, would just kind of grab something on the fly, just because the work mandated that you try to stay ahead of what's going on. A little more than a week.
You've been vacationing and relaxing?
There were a couple of down days, but it kind of ties into, again, the work serving in the role as president of the board doesn't stop. So you get, this may sound a little odd, but you almost get punished for taking days off because you just fall behind. I think anybody who's got an inbox realizes that inboxes keep getting filled up no matter what you're doing. And but anyway, there's an opportunity, and I think just to speak to the last thing that you brought up about, well, what about well-being of us as individuals? So it's very much a focus, and I think a recognition that downtime is important, and that you that there's an adequate opportunity to both decompress and maybe I would say and process the experiences. So our organization is very proactive towards looking after the mental health of the workers, and myself included. When I came back through New York and had a debriefing, part of that was with a mental health provider and talking about the stresses, experiences, and anything else that may come up. But that's kind of a routine. It's almost an assumption versus the wait till there's a problem and then try to pull somebody aside after the fact. It's the recognition that these are difficult circumstances, and the kinds of things that you see and do are ones that it's almost normal to have a maladaptive response to in some way, or challenges in facing or coping with. And so that, as I say, I think is an important part of things. But then I would say, how else do you reduce stress? And I think I would say it's like, many individuals. And I would say, is it any different than somebody here at the Ojai School? And you feel like I've got so many classes and so much homework, and how do you cope with that? And some of it is with your peers and interactions that you may have with them. Here's where I put in, and I mentioned my youngest daughter, who's working on this Master's of Fine Arts in what's called book arts at the University of Iowa. So she's doing calligraphy and paper making and letterpress and a whole variety of things that people sometimes can question. Well, what's the value of this? But I think using that as an introduction. But I think the arts is an area where that's where people escape. So I think there's tremendous value in whether you're a writer or a filmmaker or a musician, but there's those avenues of how they can enrich us, but also allow us to recharge and kind of rejuvenate ourselves. I don't think should be underestimated, and kind of making that a little bit more explicit. Probably the most common way people kind of have downtime in the field is just to plug into some video on their computer, to be honest with you, and whether that's music or movies, but or TV shows, whatever. But it's that's important. People lose sight, I think, of the value or the importance of being able to. Exactly.
I want to show our next video, and I love it because I think it really exhibits how amazing MSF is at solving problems. And this is a video about GSI mapping and the Ebola crisis.
In January of 2015, I was working in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and it was the height of the Ebola outbreak in that city. And everyone was really afraid. And unfortunately, that fear translated into a policy of containment using quarantines. And a very large number of people, entire families, entire communities were placed under quarantine. And it meant that they were essentially locked into their homes. And there wasn't a very good plan for how to get food and water and medical care to them. My team was going from quarantine to quarantine and interviewing people to see if they had what they needed to survive for that period. And what we found is virtually no one had just the basics that they needed. There were pregnant women who were locked into quarantines and they didn't know where they would go to be able to deliver their baby safely. We had situations where families were in a quarantine without access to a latrine. We had a huge database showing how many people were lacking basic necessities, but no one was really listening to us when we were trying to advocate for increasing their access to food and water and healthcare. So we gave the database to the GIS officer who was working with us, and he mapped it. And all of a sudden we had a visualization of where people were and what they needed in each of those areas. When we went to the official meeting, we put the map on the table and we had a copy for everyone. And all of a sudden they could see exactly what we were talking about, and they couldn't be ignored anymore. People actually had to change policies and change the way that they were operating in order to meet the needs of people who were under quarantine. GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. It's an out branch of mapping, but unlike a regular map, GIS is using multiple layers of data. So in the same map, you can have the physical geography of an area, but you could also have the cultural geography. This was really important to us when we were working in the beginning of the Ebola outbreak, because it was an area that hadn't been mapped before. So we needed to know where villages and roads were. We needed to know where the bridges were so that we could reach villages. We heard a lot of rumors about an area where there were cases, where there were sick people, where there were more than the usual number of funerals, and we didn't know where they were or how to reach them. Once we had maps of the areas, we could actually plan out strategically how to reach them. One of the really difficult things in Ebola is that we felt like we were always running after cases. GIS was really important to us when we were able to map the exact location of cases and then also how many cases had been found in each location. In that way, instead of simply sending medical teams to places that already had cases of Ebola, we could also send health educators to places that were geographically proximate but didn't yet have cases of Ebola. And that was really the first step that we were using to try to prevent the spread of the virus into new communities. It meant that we worked faster, it meant that we worked with better information, we could be more strategic, and ultimately we saved more lives because we had better mapping available to us.
It seems like in my research that there's this fine balance between all the data that you guys collect, all of the human rights advocacy that MSF does, and I think this is a good example of balancing the ability to be able to get access with not upsetting the country and the people that you're in. And so who is managing that in terms of wanting to deal with that fine line of advocating for human rights, but also not wanting to rock the boat too much so that you don't get access through those borders?
Yeah, and I think the best way I could answer the question, I think, or if I'm going to maybe be hopefully kind of speaking to what the core issue is, ties into the fact that anywhere we're working, we're going to be very closely collaborating with a Ministry of Health official. Right. So our role is not to supplant the existing healthcare structure or infrastructure, but to supplement it or work with them. Yeah. And so, how do we figure out where to go or what to be doing? And again, in some circumstances, the healthcare infrastructure has almost been completely decimated, and whether it's by conflict or whether it's by some natural disaster or other event that's transpired, then we have to be, assuming a larger role in providing direction more based on our experience. But I think I would say largely, this is a dialogue that we're having with people on the ground who are knowing what their given country and their society is, what the needs are and how best to respond to that. And I just kind of tie into the comments that were made in that video by Ella. Probably if you said, well, what was the single biggest element that led to the containment or the eradication then of Ebola in this current epidemic or this current large epidemic in West Africa? And the answer is it was really probably the health educators that made the biggest difference. And these were, tended to be people who were then known in the community and they would have, respect and responsibility. And so even though you see the pictures, and I don't want to, certainly diminish the role that people who are actually caring for cases had, because it was difficult work in so many regards, but it was really things, and as simple as it may sound, but changing burial practices and teaching people why they needed to do something that was slightly different than what their cultural norms were. That probably had a much greater impact on halting the Ebola epidemic than any other aspect in terms of the overall care scheme.
Yeah.
So
I have a couple. I want to leave opportunity for questions, and we're running out of time. I
Yes.
can't believe the time's gone by so fast.
Yeah.
But I have a couple questions that a student submitted this. I don't know. I would love to know which student wrote this question and sent it to me. But it's a great question. What did you have to sacrifice in order to follow your dreams? I loved it. I thought it was a great question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could possibly answer that a couple of ways. I would say a little bit of time, maybe kind of career advancement in having been in the academic world a little bit, and making a conscious decision that this was something that I wanted to devote more energy to, realizing it wasn't going to be recognized. I could say, salary, realizing that, when I kind of talked about negotiating contracts, I very much said, I want to have this period of time where I'm doing this work, and I don't expect you to compensate me during that time. But, at the end of the day, I would say, rather than, even though it is a great question, I think it's, I'm hard-pressed to say I really had to sacrifice anything. I was kind of living a dream and feel like I've been enriched more than I, had to sacrifice. So,
my last question is, the school's motto is Aún Aprendo, I am still learning. And this question I ask every guest we have is, can you share a story that sums up your greatest lessons you've learned with MSF?
Well, and I think that, and I'll harken back to your introduction and say that, it was kind of brought up, but I, very kind of late in my career, came around to this idea of the importance of public health, and mentioned that I'm, continuing to sort of struggle along on trying to get largely through online courses, but through Johns Hopkins University, a master's in public health, and I would then add parenthetically that I'm still waiting for the day that I get notification that says there's an AARP discount on their tuition. It's kind of an inside joke for the people who might be over about 45, but the AARP, the American Association of Retired People, kind of sends out information, far too early in your life. At any rate, but getting back to answering the question more seriously, the thing that I think I've come away with is, even though my career was very much based on episodic, a patient in interaction, an operation intervening and making a difference in one life, in the healthcare arena, I think the thing that really, both working with MSF, but in particular this exposure to formal curriculum in public health has taught me is that it's preventative population measures are really where healthcare's emphasis ought to be, and I'm saying that don't mean just in the settings where MSF works, but I think that very much rings true in the American healthcare system as well, where some of the mistakes or things that we're find ourselves, I think, struggling with in terms of healthcare delivery are very much geared towards not enough emphasis in preventative things and in thinking about health as in aggregate rather than what one individual needs or the benefit may be in that regard.
Yeah. Awesome. Good answer. Questions? Mark?
So I've read this flyer that we got, or like a little map, and I'm particularly interested in projects that you do in Europe. It says that 8% of your projects are in Europe, and 37 projects. And what countries are those, and what projects do you do in Europe?
So at this point, the bulk of the projects that we have in Europe are geared towards refugee populations, and so they are people who have left the environs, and of course it's there's a whole variety of countries that includes, or that both of the origin of the people who've left as well as where we're working, but it's right now in France, as odd as it may sound, but there's a big emphasis on providing health care to refugees in France that the organization doesn't feel are well met. But even kind of earlier in the progression of refugee populations heading into Europe, so Italy, Greece being other areas where we have a lot of work right now that's being done. Then I would say there's a few select projects, and I was going to say I'm not sure if it's be included in Europe or in Asia, but in Russia or the Soviet republics, the former Soviet republics, we have a fair amount of activity with TB and multi-drug resistant TB, HIV, And so they're working with populations who are marginalized or don't have access to health care. So if I'm, and again, maybe answering the question in a more direct way, when we're working in kind of high-resource countries, the emphasis tends to be on populations that are then excluded from health care, with refugee populations. But prisoners is another example of populations in a high-resource setting that may have a very serious lack of access to health care.
Brett.
So what was your first experience on the ground like for MSF, and how was it different from what you expected, if at all it was?
So my first experience was working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and as I look back on it, again, I had this. I think I'm going to use the word excitement of being in the field, and so there was I think I would say sort of a high of I'm finally living out my dreams, which persisted for quite a while in that project. It challenges that came up in that regard, and I haven't gotten into this at all, but I had never had any French and had wanted to work with the organization, and about 6 months before I first got into the field, I said, well, I'm going to start taking lessons. So I met with this tutor, and so I could, maybe order a ham sandwich or ask where the library was, but I really didn't have anything that would qualify as fluency in French for sure, and this was in a French-speaking project, and so the patients, many of them didn't speak French, but the staff themselves could translate, and so that was the kind of the common language for conducting our work there. And I had a couple of times where I thought I was saying one thing and was saying something completely different that notably came up, and in the operating room in particular. But so that sort of stood out, I think, from that experience of the importance. Even though people compensated for me and were more than willing to help, I think this is maybe again a plug for being able to speak more than one language is such an important, I think, element of being prepared to work with an organization like ours, or I think I would say in almost any profession. And sadly, I wasn't really, somebody who was well equipped in that regard, but I would say you can't ever be too fluent. And I realize there's probably some Europeans in the room here, and getting a little off the subject, but everybody I meet from Europe speaks 3 or 4 languages, and I still struggle with English on many days. But and then I think the second thing that really came up, though, was and was kind of asked or highlighted, which was just the exhaustion that started to set in from being very, very busy. So I wasn't prepared for how efficient the operating rooms were and how much work was entailed in that regard. And I think kind of the last part of what that first experience taught me was that, which was very instructive as somebody who came from a high-resourced environment, but many of my Congolese colleagues that I was working with, everyone from surgeons or other physicians to even the OR techs or the people who are scrubbing in, were in many cases far more knowledgeable on what I needed to be doing than I was. And so it's this, again, this maybe ties into the chronic learner of we all have to keep should keep our minds open for what others can teach us, and that doesn't matter where you are, if you keep your eyes and ears open, there's a lot to be gained. So
That's a great answer.
I have a question.
yeah.
So I'm just curious, because talking about the decisions that probably need to be made in the field, and when you're talking about being in Monrovia and the only surgeon, how does it work how do you triage people if somebody has a significant problem are they flown out, or that can't be addressed with the specialty that's in the country? Say it's a general surgeon and you have a cardiac issue, and are sometimes those decisions, and how do you deal with the balance of that?
Yeah. So it is a good question. So and again, maybe just to paraphrase or to kind of set the context a little bit about Liberia. So we opened up this operating room, and there was myself as a pediatric surgeon. There was an anesthesiologist that was also from the U.S., as it turned out. He was the only anesthesiologist in the country. So Liberia has 5 million people, and everybody else providing anesthesia in the country is a nurse anesthetist. And again, one shouldn't presume that these aren't very capable or qualified people, but it speaks to some degree to the relative lack of adequate development, I guess I would say, of particular specialties. So everything's geared towards primary care because that's what's most common and what's going to be most helpful. But it hasn't been possible to kind of meet the needs that exist there. So from a surgical side, talking about triaging things, and again, sometimes in the field it literally can be there's more patients who are critically ill than you can take care of, and you go into a mode of, this is somebody I don't think is going to survive regardless, sadly. Here's somebody who I can optimally benefit if I devote my resources or energy now. And then here's somebody over here we need to get to at some point, but maybe it could be in a few days. And those kinds of decisions are things that, at times I've had to make, I've alluded to in, several different venues. When I was working in the Ivory Coast, one day there was a truck rollover and 26 patients came into the hospital kind of in various vehicles over about 15 minutes. And it was a matter of deciding I've got to figure out who to focus on first. And, that's just something that you wind up having to do, not commonly, but at times there. But again, is no different than, to some degree, what practitioners here may encounter. And then getting into the area of realizing that there's nobody who's equipped to take care of it. And so, we'd had a child with a particular surgical problem or congenital malformation that dealt with the GI tract that I felt I could take care of, but it had a congenital heart problem that there's no open heart surgery that's done there. And you'd love to say, gosh, that we'll be able to fly that patient to some destination, but the reality is that's not very feasible, unfortunately. And so then it came down to, we aren't going to be able to correct this. Do we realize it was going to make that child's anesthetic a little bit more risky? Do we proceed ahead and try to do what we can, which is what we did in this case? But these are, I'm going to sort of say ethical quandaries that come up not infrequently. And I think, being kind of having a ethical framework to be part of your skill set is important in providing health care, of course, here in the U.S. as well, but much more so there because you really do have to make some pretty difficult decisions at times about where you decide to put your emphasis. Somebody had a question there, yes.
So earlier you mentioned that the workers that do return, you tend to have mental health consultations with them. And in the brochure that we received yesterday, it said that you do a lot of mental health consultations in the field with the patients.
Yes.
And I've found, myself, that there's a stereotype that doctors don't really see the mental health part. It's more just focused on the physical. And I'm curious, what do you think? Is it important for there to be an emphasis on mental health, or are you more just focus on the physical and we'll deal with the trauma stuff later? Yeah.
So I am going to say, much more the former, and I think you brought up what I think is a great issue overall. But I think if you said within American medicine, but I think you could expand that globally. What's the most neglected discipline within it? And I would say it's mental health services. And so it doesn't matter what element of society you come from, accessing the ability to access those individuals and the importance of what that means to overall well-being, I think, has been grossly underestimated. Certainly in the U.S., it's under-resourced, both in terms of the amount of money that's devoted to it, as well as the compensation for people that provide it. And I think it's it's one of the I think kind of biggest tragedies to some degree that exists in the American healthcare system, given how prevalent the range of problems is, and whether we're talking about depression to psychosis to addiction issues. I mean, these are all areas that need so much importance. Then kind of putting this into the, back into the our projects in particular and for the patients. And so, again, working in Liberia, if you go back and look at the 25 years history of Liberia, so what any adult in their, just pick a range, 40s, there was 20 years of or 15 years anyway, of a very significant, horrific civil war that kind of completely destabilized the country. an interval of where things were fairly good, then the Ebola epidemic. And so if you said, could you meet anybody who would be of an adult age who wouldn't have been affected in some way by one of those and potentially seen things that were, very stressful, that could, certainly be a source of imbalance in the, in their overall well-being from a mental health standpoint, and or would just be stressors that are ongoing related to this loss of relatives and whatever. So things that we, again here where we have a lot of kind of comforts, we still think of as being very significant issues to be dealing with over there. I would say there's probably hardly a person that hasn't been affected. So, the project I was within Liberia that MSF is doing right now there's two emphases. The one is pediatric health, and the other is actually mental health issues. So I think it's an important one, and one that in particular in conflict and natural disaster settings that I feel most proud about is actually bringing in mental health practitioners sort of side by side, realizing that physical trauma is important, but you have to be dealing with kind of mental trauma of those circumstances at the same time. So really great question. Yeah.
What is the process to navigate with both sides, or negotiate with both sides to indicate neutrality?
So and again, all these questions are so insightful, as I'm often impressed by, that you're kind of distilling about literally things that we talk about at a very high level in our board meetings and so forth. But so let me kind of give you two different scenarios to contrast. So in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the hospital that I had worked in, and actually on a couple of different occasions, was really the regional medical center for that part of the country. So we were serving the biggest needs exist just for the civilian population, who really are the main ones that need health care in any conflict zone. People lose sight of that, but it's not combatants that we're treating. But answering the question now more directly, our value, because we treat individuals on both sides, that kind of preserves our status as an entity to be not trampled upon, if I can use that, or attacked, because both the rebel soldiers, the government soldiers, and anybody else who's on the ground realize we're the facility that's going to welcome anybody who needs care, or that may be their relatives or whoever it is. So there's a abiding interest for everybody on the ground to be very much buying into keep making sure that our facility and our personnel is protected as much as possible. So this neutrality that you talked about, which is one of our central tenets, really works very much in our advantage in that regard. Then, having said that, one of the biggest challenges we face are attacks against healthcare facilities and against personnel. And so, the event in Kunduz, Afghanistan from several years ago was maybe the best publicized, but they're occurring, every day in Syria, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And in Yemen, it's been an issue, and in South Sudan, it's a problem. And so sometimes these are more, and I'm using Syria as an example, it really is a more intentional means to sort of intimidate, I guess I would say. And sometimes it just speaks to the lawlessness that's kind of implicit in the backgrounds or the countries where we're working. But the issue is that the neutrality, or what's meant to be guaranteed by the Geneva Conventions, that healthcare facilities, healthcare providers, and patients in a hospital are meant to be sort of off limits from being attacked by warring parties, are not being they're not being recognized or honored in a number of venues in the world right now, and that's a particular challenge for us, and one that we've brought before the United Nations and speak about frequently. But there's not an easy solution to how you can be able to ensure that those kind of events won't happen. So it comes down to us organizationally just having to be very conscious always of security issues, and potentially saying, even though we very much feel like we would like to be in this particular setting, having to pull our teams out because we don't sense that the circumstances on the ground would allow us to guarantee that we can keep our personnel safe, or may not even create more of a problem by being in a facility that then is going to be targeted. So
I think that's all we have time for. In a world that can be real cynical on TV sometimes, it was really a pleasure to meet you, and I think that in a world where we all need heroes and mentors, you fit the bill for me, John.
Wow.
You really do. So I really, really deeply appreciate the time you've given to us.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Yeah, well, thank you.
Another round of applause.
Yeah. Well, and let me just very briefly say thank you for the invitation to speak. And I think the sort of the corollary of what I'd like to bring about related to those last few very kind words that were directed my way is that very much why is this an important opportunity for me is that you sitting in this room are the future. It's and whether that's in healthcare or otherwise, but I think that to try to hopefully instill some of the what I'm going to call optimism and the recognition that in healthcare careers, but in a whole lot of careers, there is a means to impact other people and other people's lives. And so, as I say, I think to try to counter some of the negative narrative that exists, I think, in the U.S. or globally. I'm here to say there is another side, and hopefully people can be thinking about that and considering that, and that, as I say, I sort of view the people here who are, under 20 in the audience, not that there's not other important elements there, but, the whole faculty just got dissed, I think, in one comment there. But no, very much. You are, you as the students are the future, and I think in so many ways are better equipped than I was to face the challenges ahead of you. So, yeah, there we are. Thank you.